Hi, my name is Natasha Blycha, and I am emerging technology lawyer who is very interested in making sure that we bring the right rules into artificial intelligence.
Welcome to the African Tech Roundup, Natasha.
Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. And we need to start with how it is you go from an exchange teacher in Zimbabwe in the 90s, teaching English to ya boy, to now one of Australia, certainly, but one of the world's perhaps most accomplished and articulate proponents for IP law in the age of AI.
Gosh, when I was in Zimbabwe, and that's when we met, I was actually doing it, as you said, it was a volunteer year, it was a gap year for me, and I actually was studying law. And one of the things that happened is I was doing economics and law. I'd just finished the economics component. I still had a couple of years to finish law. And I thought I really need to go somewhere and get some real life experience. And I was lucky enough that the school took me on to teach economics and English. But the thing that I don't think you remember that I did at the time, which has really had a massive impact on me in the way that I've progressed in my legal career, is I also was working at the same time for a very small rural law firm called Danziger and Partners in town.
I do remember you going back and forth to town for things.
I did. I used to go to town because I used to work a couple of days after the school day, and we were working on constitutional questions. So I did some really interesting work at that time, and I was around whether there was land invasions. So I certainly got exposed to an entirely different perspective about the rule of law. And I think once you start asking foundational questions, and we lived the underlay, we know what happened in Zim when we were there, and we just start asking questions is what happens to a country if there isn't foundational law working really well? And I think those questions have stuck with me, and they've certainly had an impact on my career. As I came back to the law, stopped being that teacher that I was, I'm very glad I did that, and went back to practicing law.
That is actually an excellent nail to hang the coat that is this conversation, because I'd like to ask you what it is about you in that setting that would be completely surprised by the way the world you currently serve has evolved.
I mean, I can take that answer a few different ways. Let's start with three things that one, we couldn't get books at that time. So we weren't anywhere near the internet as a school. We were really struggling even to get analog books in the library. So that was my first memory. There was a major currency crisis that was going on in Zimbabwe at the time. We couldn't get fuel. I don't know if you remember, we couldn't even get to I think it was the National Choir Championships. I can't remember what it was.
We were supposed to go.
Yeah, we were supposed to go and we couldn't get fuel to go.
We had the bus, no fuel.
That's right. And we still had typewriters. I remember being one evening at a place called the Barter Club, they made shoes in Gweru. And we went
Canadian company with effectively at the time the largest manufacturing facility in Gweru, third largest city in Zimbabwe. Our school was, call it 20 Ks out of that little town, really. It's called a city, but it was a town. And the Barter Club basically had the expat haunt come,
a bit, and maybe I'm ashamed of that, but I'm not ashamed of what I'm going to say now. It was the first time I ever saw a text message.
No way. On a phone?
It was on a phone, and I remember there was someone there who sent a text message, and watching it go between England and it wasn't a smartphone, it was a dead phone, but yeah, it went between England and Zim, and I just remember going, oh my gosh. That was amazing.
What year is this? Just for people listening, just to locate the conversation, the memory.
Year 2000. I think it was 99, 2000.
Yeah. Get out.
You know what? It definitely was, because I was very poor, and to get the flight over, it was hard for me to get the flight. So I bought the flights on the day that was the Y2K bug was supposed to go all wrong.
Nothing happened.
Nothing happened, but it was really cheap flights. So that's how I know it was 2000. There you go.
Beautiful segue with that Y2K reference to the world we're in now. There was probably a version of cataclysmic disaster everyone imagined would happen off the back of how technology was going to impact the real world. Today, my journalistic mandate, my editorial mandate, is located at the intersection of the real economy and this imagined, to some degree, but in some ways very real emerging digital economy. And at the intersection, a lot of interesting things happen. And already our conversation is demonstrating what that world looked like just outside Gweru circa 2000. So thinking back and now perhaps looking forward, here now, is this our Y2K moment with everything you're now focused on as a lawyer?
I wish I could say it was, but I don't think it is.
Okay.
And even as you saw with Y2K, that was a vector of magnitude smaller of complexity than what we're facing with AI. But it still caused enormous policy challenges across the planet. It still caused enormous compliance budgets inside of organizations to prepare for that situation. And this is so much more complicated, so much more geopolitically complicated. And if we said that Y2K didn't happen, it was one day we got to find out, did it happen or not happen? What we're seeing already with AI systems is we're already getting the proof in the pudding that they are working. And we do have the large tech companies, or big tech as we call it, are working to their global mandate. And their mandate is to reach this pinnacle, which is AGI. So we're on the path. We can't say this is Y2K because the things are actually happening.
Let's talk about those things then, because I see a gap between promise and implementation, particularly in markets with infrastructure constraints, not unlike Zimbabwe or frankly any other market on the continent. This is even more advanced. Call it South Africa, where I've spent most of my adult life. Infrastructure constraints, diverse legal traditions, what works and doesn't, and what surprisingly does sometimes is sometimes counterintuitive. And so I wonder, having been part of like actual deployments of things like smart contracts, theory versus reality here, give me a sense of what has surprised you from moving from academic constructs of some of these conversations to what actually manifests in the real world.
I think it's worth pointing out from the outset that what is happening in some countries is not exactly the same that's happening in other countries. So I think what you're touching on there from an operationalization point is that if I cannot keep the power on, am I really talking about agentic AI? If I can't stop graft in respect of my electricity generation, am I really going to move into a position where everybody's going to be displaced by AI? So it's not always the same everywhere and it's a bit patchy, but it is a position in Africa right now that some countries will be slower to adopt the initial phases of AI. But there are countries around the world, I'm exposed to many jurisdictions and work in many jurisdictions, where you can see an extremely rapid AI uptake, particularly of generative AI. And actually, I've been in boardrooms recently where you have large banks, for example, who are working rapidly on their agentic AI policies, working on their agentic AI tools, which will in fact displace workers now. That doesn't mean that I think that Africa has a problem if it's slower on some of these tools now, or if it doesn't make economic sense or doesn't make sense in the paradigms of what's there. One thing you do have in Africa that's different to some other countries is you have a very young population. So let's look at somewhere like Nigeria, and you've got 60% of the population is under 25. What you can have is you have status quo and you have less adoption of some of these technologies because you're dealing with the lights on point. What are the actual technologies I'm using? How am I working with human bodies still? How am I still living every day, walking instead of going and buying a car or using a tractor rather than 20 people? In those economies, you can do this jump. And we saw that with India, is because you don't get stuck in the early transition problems of a particular technology, but then because you don't have all the old infrastructure that you can move immediately to the newer infrastructure. An example of that I'll give is with, for example, crypto adoption and payment adoptions, smartphone infiltration in Africa. So there are some things where you'll see there'll be more rapid adoption because you're not dealing with legacy tech as well.
So just to break down the idea of a smart contract, I'm glad you touched on crypto, because when I started to reconnect with your work as an adult, well over a decade after you and I were in Zimbabwe together, it was actually around the work you're doing in crypto and smart contracts. I'm sure you're doing other things too, but I think it's an interesting thing you raise here. For all intents and purposes, for a lot of people, this is like a theoretical, almost safeguarding policy question and not one rooted in a pragmatic, how does this impact how people say exchange value and or trade? So to what degree is what you're observing today in the AI space? And I think crypto is a great example of how we've started to see how that world felt like a tech bros hype trend to how it's actually impacting a place like Nigeria and how people solve for currency uncertainties and actually do business. So I wonder, what are you seeing across some of these jurisdictions there? Let's start with some of the more advanced ones like the one you live in and live and work from in Australia. What's the spectrum of what a smart contract actually is and how it actually impacts real life, everyday people in the real economy?
So why don't we start with some definitions? Because even the word smart contract is super confusing because it's used by different people in different ways. So I'm going to start with the crypto definition of smart contract and say that you can basically have smart contract as a synonym for a token or a crypto asset. So a cryptocurrency or a non-fungible token, an NFT, all of these are run by things called smart contracts. But all they are is executing code. So the code that says to do something. If this happens, do this. But the difference with a smart contract is it's some code that does something on a particular piece of plumbing called a blockchain, which all your listeners will be familiar with. So that's a smart contract. It's a token, okay? It's something that happens on a blockchain or distributed water technology. There is an extension of that concept, which is what I do most of my work on, which is the real end of a contract. So that thing I just talked about, smart contract, it's a bit of a cheeky word because it's not actually a contract. It's not a legal agreement like your employment contract or, your lease that you get for a shop.
It's a technical term almost.
It's a technical term. However, the concepts there is at the two bookends. There's a smart contract here, a bit of code running on a blockchain saying if this happens, do this. And then on the other side of the equation is a smart legal contract. The word legal is important there because it is actually real contracts. So that's an example where I might have, you don't even need to have a blockchain. It's actually a contract that certain clauses inside the contract might actually start to do things and collect data. So what might be an example of that? Maybe your contract says that you're going to pay rent if there's a change to your CPI or your consumer price index. If that goes up, your rent goes up. What a smart legal contract does is...
And sorry, you are in this instance, in that framing?
I might be the actual landlord, okay? And I've said to you, your rent will go up by CPI every year, okay?
As a hedge against economic uncertainties of some kind.
That's right. But your rent, it was $50 this year, and next year it's going to go up to $52 or $53, depending on how much inflation is in the country. So what a smart legal contract does is it takes that clause that says that part about the change to CPI and it turns it into code. So it's called an API call that's made back to a point, which is usually some kind of rate that tells you what the CPI is, and then it changes the contract. So the contract then actually does the work of performing itself. So that's not a familiar concept to most listeners. It's very nascent technology, but those are the bookends of the words smart contract and smart legal contract. And just to confuse people, in some jurisdictions, law commissions and law councils, they use the word smart contract to describe the smart legal contract So your question to me was, though, what do you see happening with these things?
Yeah, so where are these being deployed in ways that would impact everyday life of people listening to this show and perhaps the vast majority of people who don't have the privilege of being able to, but have these things impacting them anyway?
Yeah, so let's be clear. They sound like these sort of playful comments about a smart contract or a crypto asset, but these are $1 trillion market of crypto assets. But they won't be, if I looked at my family, for example, or I looked at my friends, 99% of them never touch crypto assets because they've also got a bit of a smell to them sometimes, highly volatile, for example. They're not used by women most of the time. And actually the demographic that is highly leveraged on crypto tends to be a US male, or the weird, what do they call, weird white Anglo-Saxon male.
I suppose the whole tech bros idea is actually a thing, it sounds like.
Yeah. It's
tech and finance bro.
30s to 48. That is the graphic who mainly uses crypto. Having said that, because crypto in some ways bypassed, and the blockchains, they bypass traditional financial markets. Aside from that group, like your American crypto investors who are doing it for a game, a bit of gambling, a lot of them, investing in discretionary cash, What we also saw in some of developing countries is we saw an increase in adoption in places like the Philippines, in some of these African countries like Nigeria, like Ghana, because if you couldn't get a normal bank account, or for example, you wanted to make a remittance payment, or you just wanted to not, money critical, you don't want to lose your money through.
Just as a store of value even.
This is a store of value. Then you find these crypto assets being picked up in those economies to just be used as money. It's effectively being used as money.
You actually answered a question I had in my mind about what it would take for a lawyer to be involved in these affairs. It almost made sense as someone covering tech to see like early adoption in some of the genres of participation you described, effectively like the tax finance bro, the quasi, we call it speculation, but really it's just a proxy for gambling that constitutes even mainstream VC as a genre or as an asset class to the extent to which it is. My question was, and you answered it, what would necessitate a lawyer getting involved? And so at what point in your career does this become mainstream enough to the point where the smart contract as a technical construct and as almost a niche high-end thing we do for fun with our spare money turns into something you build an entire book of business on, or at least a decent vertical within your law firm, Stirling and Rose?
As I said, money gets attention. And the thing is, so my career has been in corporate law. I have worked in large global law firms. So you're right to say it's not something where if it's just a founder who's got a snazzy idea, something illegal, it's something that I'm going to be working on. But it
has to be a real economic thing, and maybe is what I'm trying to say. It has to be part of the meat of how the real economy works in some shape or form, I imagine, for a lawyer to be involved.
Right. And I said to you that I'm a technology lawyer, and that is absolutely true. I am. But I'm also a regulatory lawyer. So the two reasons that I got involved is one is because I would help large corporates who were dealing with this as an innovation. So first of all, what happened in the blockchain crypto asset space, let's say post 2017, is a lot of banks and a lot of tech companies and a lot of payments companies were saying, there's something here, we'd like to experiment with this technology. So of course, large corporates, if they're going to experiment, they want their lawyers to get involved to say, oh, can you actually check off that this is even legal? What are we doing? So my first foray into these markets were through large consortiums who were doing work in blockchain and crypto assets to basically experiment with those projects or alternatively make investments in those projects.
Okay.
So in order to make an investment, if you're a large corporate, you want to do due diligence. So again, some of my first work in these projects was looking for large corporates who were established institutions who were saying, if we're going to make an investment here, we need to find out it's not illegal. Basically, or they're doing what they're saying they're doing. And of course, you find out very quickly, some of them were illegal. Why were they illegal? Because
awkward.
the reason that many of them have been illegal, depending on which country you're in at what time, is because ultimately the law in most countries says this. If you are going to look after someone's money or you're going to act as a steward for someone else, you have to look after it in a way that's more appropriate, more conditioned to paying attention and reporting on how you're doing that properly. So what that means is in most countries, there's financial services laws. You have laws about running markets because there's a more expectation that you will do things in a better way. Because when people don't have to look after other people's money really well, they tend to take that money and use it for themselves. So crypto assets are actually, really push comes to shove, they're another form of money. People will tell you they're not. There's other legal definitions. We won't get into here about securities and what they actually are.
I will actually share an excellent conversation you've had on another podcast in the show notes, because again, lots of really fertile ground to cover. And you're so great. You see, the teacher in you keeps coming out. You're really great at bringing things down to where I imagine someone who's even doing their GCSEs or O-level or matric right now will completely understand. So I'll put that in the show notes, but you can carry on.
Yeah, so I think that the thing is that because the thing about crypto, which was so confusing for a long period of time with the law, is that we didn't know when something is tangible, when you touch it, let's say my glasses, I think I have property rights over these things because I am holding them, so I ascribe value to them. And when crypto assets first came along, they're not real. It's nothing. It doesn't actually exist. It's not real. So therefore, I don't care about ascribing property rights to it. I don't care if someone steals it from someone else. The law didn't get too involved initially. And even on top of that, something much more complicated, which happened with Bitcoin, which is if you're going to make someone responsible, you need to find someone who is responsible. And what happened with the very first crypto asset of Bitcoin was that it was invented by someone who doesn't exist, or we never could identify who it was.
As a deliberate conceit of its existence. By
Correct. Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever that is. Okay, maybe dead, maybe alive.
Whomever or whoever they are.
But the law needs a person to ascribe responsibility to. And in this case with Bitcoin, it ran itself. Remember, it's just code. The plumbing ran itself. So immediately we said, okay, it's outside of all our rules. Now, the thing that happened as more platforms developed, the plumbing got more sophisticated. We moved into other plumbing like Ethereum, Solana, Polygon. We start to say we can find people to point the finger at. But there is still questions there where people who are, let's call them purists in the crypto community, will say it's a decentralized autonomous organization. It's not us. We didn't do it. It's the code. You want to get cross with someone if something goes wrong? It ain't us. It's the code. And then we have a big legal problem because the law is not created to deal with code as the perpetrator. It's not possible to put code in jail.
And the other sort of rabbit hole you could go down, which we won't now, is for some people that is entirely the point, to undermine or solve for what they perceive as a failing or perpetually unjust dispensation of law and finance. A conversation hosted by Kate Byrne, shout out to you, Kate, interviewing a couple of consultants in the space at least a couple of years ago or more. The question really was, can we trust AI? And I think fundamental to what I'm hearing you say is this question of trust and accountability. And I think what's trending in a very big way on the continent, but in other places as well. You've heard Jensen Huang of NVIDIA speak to it with his 5-layer cake sensibility of what a good AI stack looks like. And I imagine most nations, policymakers, certainly technologists, big tech leaders in most nations, in most jurisdictions, African nations are looking at this and thinking, how do we set up our own stack? How do we set up a sense of sovereignty and ownership around the infrastructure, but also the mechanics? How do we set up a way where we can create a sense of accountability that puts us in a position to assert legal rights, but also ensure futures for the people we're trying to build for or protect by mandate or because we just want the world to be a better place? I say all of that to say that might be that might be a useful sort of segue between the whole crypto conversation, your practice in it, and how AI might in some ways have similar dynamics or be perceived similarly to how crypto early on was.
Let's use the segue that in the AI stack, the AI tech stack, let's just say Africa wants to get to sovereign AI. America wants to get to sovereign AI. In that tech stack, one of the layers is responsible AI. Okay?
For the reasons you described about needing to assign accountability and responsibility. Okay.
To ensure that it's ethical standards and it's used in an appropriate way in respect of data and all those things, all those good things. But if you go into this AI tech stack, it's really geopolitically interesting. At the moment, if you look at what's happening with different countries who are trying to get their own sovereign AI, but you've got all these layers, and I'm not going to be able to go through them all, remember them, but this is something that every nation needs to think about is, do I have the AI applications? Do I have control of my own data and models? Do I actually have sovereignty in respect of the cloud and AI platforms that I'm using? That's before you even get to hardware. You just spoke about Jensen Huang and NVIDIA. Do I have access to semiconductor chips? Do I have compute? Do I have storage?
Do I have the power to run the whole bang shoot?
Absolutely. Energy, supply, and grid. And this is coming back to what we talked about South Africa. So there's a whole bunch of things. There's connectivity, data centers. Do I have the data? And then on top of all of that, the icing on the cake is, do I have the legal infrastructure to hold that together in a way that means that I haven't basically ripped off the people in my country in a way where already some people are gaining the benefits of this. There's something I would love to talk to you about, which I'm super interested in. A couple of years ago, my mum is South African, And I hadn't been back to Africa since the time that I was teaching. And I was really excited because 2 years ago I brought my whole family back, and I've got 4 kids and a beautiful husband. And we went to Tanzania and we climbed Mount Kilimanjaro together. And then when we came back from Tanzania, we spent time in South Africa visiting all the family and getting to see everything that's happening in South Africa. And it was absolutely wonderful, and we learned so much, and I felt like I was brought back into the bosom of the family. But I don't remember really learning about Ubuntu when I was teaching in Zim. And it was the first time that I was really guided into that principle, which will make probably all your listeners laugh at me. But I hadn't really understood it. And from a spiritual perspective, a techno-spiritual perspective, the two are being linked together in some AI policies, which probably make some people hearts, but it also is the right ethical framework in some ways to say we're all connected. Who should benefit from AI development inside my nation?
And Ubuntu would be the principle of I am because you are. And so the sense that this is what you're broaching here, I think, the idea that we can't have a constructive conversation about AI sovereignty or any other sort of construct related to us deploying it to ensure it does us good as nations, as a continent, as a world, without considering the values tier.
This is the thing that I would want to say to any country that's approaching the sovereign AI point, is that you have to be super pragmatic. There's just hard, cold investment that's required. You're not going to get anywhere if you don't have your own GPU clusters. You're not going to get anywhere if you don't have access to your own cloud compute or storage. But at the same time, if you are completely giving away your actual values in pursuit of an efficiency tech that is not, no one should assume it's necessarily for the benefit of humanity to have more AI. And we shouldn't assume that for a second. No one knows the answer to that question. So we need to do both sets of things. And I love this concept of Ubuntu. I would hate for it to be used as window dressing for someone to write a wishy-washy policy that then doesn't deal with the hard stuff. And the reason it matters, if we say we just don't want to have AI at all, which may be actually a sensible policy position, what you don't want to be in is a situation where it's almost neo-colonial in a way, where you end up dependent on another nation state because they're holding your AI layers of your tech stack, and then you have to use them and pay them, especially when we have some hegemonic powers here at the moment who are not necessarily in it for the best interests of other countries.
It feels like the horse is bolted on crypto as far as that's concerned. Many major markets on the continent and around the world haven't been party, with some exception, of course, haven't been party to the mining wave that saw the accumulation of Bitcoin at a sort of sovereign level or at a meaningful level within the retail tier or everyday person tier. And now it does feel like, with all these efforts to build on top of that, to almost turn Bitcoin specifically into a mainstream asset class. With the AI question, there's a potential to frame that earlier on, take lessons from everything that didn't work so well or we didn't take the chance to be a part of as early adopting nations. It sounds like this is what you're saying. It's saying maybe we can actually see this as an advantage, being behind on the curve, as it were, to think things through, really strategize about how to participate.
Yeah, but look at what's happening across Africa. I think it's only Nigeria who's got a comprehensive AI law that's coming into power. There's a few others, and forgive me if I'm not sufficiently familiar.
If there are others, they're probably in development or not quite as well publicized, but Nigeria certainly.
You saw the same thing with the EU AI Act. Go out hard, have a piece of law, and then have to backtrack on certain portions because it's not fit for purpose. But you do have a whole lot of soft rules that are coming through South Africa, Kenya. You've got, even Zimbabwe's got a national AI strategy. But I think it's appropriate to hold a degree of cynicism about some of these.
Not even skepticism, cynicism.
Yeah, I'm going to go with that. That's fine.
Okay.
Because there's profit motive in a lot of these technologies. If you hang out with crypto people, sometimes it can feel like a bit of a cult for some of them. Some of that's probably pathological, no disrespect. Some of it is actually beautiful. And that's because there is a feeling in there that we don't want to be held by tyrannical governments, or we don't trust our state. So having alternate money supplies, for example, feels really safe.
or being outsiders of the system feels really safe. But unfortunately, very quickly in these markets, you move from being, let's call it the resistance tech, very quickly gets funded, gets pulled into through venture capital, gets funded by incumbent traditional market players, and then it's just part of the system. And so many founders who were so against the system become the system, just the system.
One of the things we have covered is partnerships with NVIDIA and other players such as them on the continent by various large, call it our local sort of big tech infrastructure players here in Africa. Is there a version of sovereignty and or the level of agency you're describing that's possible if you're hitched to an NVIDIA or some Chinese counterpart or really anybody else who's developed a stack at a sovereign level or even at an enterprise grade global tech level? Is there hope if most African states don't seem to have the capacity at the moment to compete at the level of creating their own NVIDIAs from scratch alongside the rest of the complementary stack items that are required? Partnerships seem to be the most pragmatic step forward to participate at all. Is there any hope of having the sovereignty or agency if that's the case?
Some large players can have sovereignty. I think you're right in what you're suggesting, which is if you're a smaller or less wealthy nation, it can be difficult to have sovereignty without relying on others. I don't know if you've seen the Mark Carney speech that was given at Davos. He's saying some really interesting things. It's probably one of those speeches that may go down in history, where he's saying it is a moment in time where everybody has to call out what is happening, and we need to actually start making new partnerships and new supply chains across those things that we need to be able to continue our sovereignty, not just AI sovereignty, but each nation's sovereignty generally. So the old world order of who shares our values might be changing. And so he talks about it, you used the right word, he talks about making pragmatic relationships based on a case-by-case basis. Africa, it's one block in a way.
You may as well be comparing, I don't know, the Fiji Islands with Canada, for the most part, per state times 50 plus, you know?
Absolutely. At very different levels of sophistication in pockets of places as well. But if you look where the money's tracking, the partner that's already there from One Belt, One Road is China. So most of the infrastructure and most of the deals that are taking place across Africa are happening with China. I believe this to be correct, that China has made more technology investments in Africa and infrastructure investments in Africa than all other nations combined.
When you certainly account for the role China is playing as, this is ironic, as an enabler of sovereign infrastructure builds and the capacity to build sovereign homegrown things, in addition to providing markets for outputs, but also being a primary buyer of raw materials, which...
You don't get something for free.
No, it's a very complicated relationship, but it's actually a very powerful one. So I imagine once you do a proper count across all those genres of trade activities, it's not even close, I don't think.
And what it is now is it's not if this sort of post-World War II order is coming undone, it's not what we thought it was. There's lots of people saying that now. Then who's your new friends? That's the most playground description of what we're talking about here. New deals, put assumptions aside about who shares your values, because actually you don't know who shares your values anymore. So it's about strong leadership inside each nation and then going and making the deals. What's probably a little bit scary, again, for me as a lawyer, is international law is really unstable. It is the most unstable it's been since the inception of international law.
So you can't count, for example, on advising a client to act in a certain way on the strength of certain precedents, or you counting on how international law deals with this or that. You're effectively, in a way, flying blind. Is that what you're saying? I mean, you can't count on anything?
We still advise conservatively, and a lot of nations are still party to the treaties that underpin international law rather. But there are things happening which require international consequences. And even if there's laws and you have people abiding by those laws, once someone doesn't abide by international law and you don't get enforcement taking place. So we've seen that in some countries where you have decisions of the International Court of Justice, for example, there's no enforcement taking place. Do we actually care about the laws if no one enforces them.
Someone clicked on this, is listening to this on the strength of the title, and maybe it was 10 minutes in and assumed there was going to be lots of AI talk, maybe some crypto. We're suddenly talking geopolitics. It sounds as an unplanned sort of, but apparently a very necessary chapter in the conversation. Help someone who's like, how is this even still about AI? Maybe join the dots between the law, the values thing that you touched on, strong leadership and geopolitical questions, international law and AI, sovereignty, and then pragmatism. Where's the pragmatism in all of that? I don't see it.
I'm happy to hop out and give a sermon here because this is my life's work. This is my life's passion. And it did start with that time in Zimbabwe of seeing what happens when the rule of law breaks down. If we're seeing laws break down now, and we're still all people, all the stakeholders in the game are still people, and the law works for people, we have a very big problem coming, is that we are replacing people with AI systems as new economic stakeholders. And what we just touched on earlier is that law without enforcement is basically useless. So when we bring in new AI systems as stakeholders, particularly with agentic AI systems, so that's when you give a particular context to an AI system, and it might be, go to Microsoft, go and click on there, go to McKinsey, they'll tell you we're selling AI agents to take your job even. Fine.
By the way, McKinsey's a really good example who basically said, we've dumped all these people because we don't need them because AI. We've got so many thousand, call it 60 or whatever. I can't quite remember the number right now. And a good, I don't know, third or something rather. And again, I might be wrong about this, but it's a decent chunk of those employees that they still have on their books are these AI agents you're talking about. Contextually, you're saying we're moving to a dispensation where we see more of this headline by the likes of McKinsey, governments, big tech, big corporations. Okay.
So fundamental issue here. How do you do an employment contract with an agent? Okay, then you say, I don't need to, because as good AI laws everywhere, or all the African declarations on AI, or all the bills or the frameworks that everybody have, they all say, you know what, we want a human in the loop, or we want a human on the loop, which means that if an AI agent does something, guess who's going to be responsible? We know we can't make the AI system itself responsible. We're going to make you underlay responsible. So you set out an agent that goes and does books your flights for you. It happens to do something that causes some kind of breach of the law. Guess who's responsible? Underlay. And you say at some point fairly, the AI system can book 1 million flights. Its span of control is so far out of my capability. There is no way that I can possibly be on the loop, paying attention, giving direction to that AI system. So you have the law breaking down at that point. So then let's thread the needle back through all of this and say, okay, then if I have an AI system, and Natasha, you're telling me we're all doomed because the AI systems are coming and yet the law doesn't respond to them, what we did is we have worked with putting smart legal contracts into the AI systems. I like to think of it as most basic metaphorical level of saying putting a conscience or a rule-based system into an AI system, where the contracts are the rules that are bespoke. The best example of this is there's a product called LexChip, and LexChip puts contracts into AI edge devices, so these embodied AI devices. So it might be robotics, it might be a car with AI systems. So most hardware devices, most machines will have AI, embodied AI, all of them going forward. In those systems, do you want a world where a contract can effectively create, that system breaches the law or it breaches its contract, the contract itself can act as a referee and stop the behaviour, even to the point of actually stopping the device in a safe way. So that is what the power of smart legal contracts can do. So you've taken an analog thing, you've turned it into a performance-based contract, and it can speak to an AI system. The two can be connected.
Wow.
And that's why I'm very passionate about smart legal contracts. I came from that smart contract world. We've given it the grown-up methodology of smart legal contracts, which are really powerful and make money and do wonderful things, but they're also probably the best tool that I have seen in actually getting to responsible AI.
Who would see everything you described as just getting in the way of us being the best version of ourselves, just failing quickly and failing forward for the sake of progress? We don't have time for this, Natasha. We don't have time for your idealistic and lengthy and protracted legal drafting. Get out of the way. The future needs to come in. Who in your world is the most practically opposed to everything you described, and why?
I wouldn't be speaking out of turn if I said Peter Thiel here. And the reason I would say Peter Thiel is because you can put it in your show notes. Your listeners can listen. There was a New York Times podcast he did at the end of 2025. There is a certain portion of Silicon Valley and also technical people around the globe. It's not everyone. It's certainly not everyone who would say that someone like me is a decelerator and they are accelerators. So what we're doing by saying put rules into AI systems is we are decelerating. But the thing is, if you listen to what they want to accelerate to, this comes back to what I love about Africa. What is it that we actually love in Africa? What is it that I love in my life? I love it when I'm at my farm and my kids are outside and we're doing physical things and we're together and we're swimming. Those are the things I love.
Community, togetherness.
Whatever. The accelerator world and the mission that we're stopping them through these laws of getting to is a transhumanist world.
Hyper-individualistic.
Hyper-individualistic, but this is a world of brain-computer interfaces. This is a world where we transcend lifespan and we can have perpetual infinite life. Yes, maybe what we're doing is saying, hold the phone. Let's be a little bit careful. I want to be really clear here. This is not a lawyers versus the tech bros conversation, because there is an extremely large majority of the tech bros, using that term, who are also saying there is a big problem here. We need to stop. We need to be very careful. So I think that, but there is, you asked me, who are the people? There are people who divide us into the A cells and the D cells.
The A cells and the D cells. And so now like bring this conversation down to, and I remember you said earlier on, the vast majority of people, even in your world, you're essentially in a developed economy, in a first world economy, for lack of a better terminology, being based in Australia. And even in your world, most of the people in your world don't sense or feel the impact of the stuff we've been discussing on their everyday lives. Is it fair to say?
I would say my family and friends would sometimes just wish I would be quiet. In somewhere like Australia, the US, you tap and pay everywhere. You don't use cash anymore, 99% of the time. I would say that most people that I'm in a particular echelon as well, the average person is starting to use a ChatGPT style generative AI tool nearly every day. Once people get using them, they start to use them all the time. This train has left the station. And let's just come back to money again and the capitalist system. I always like to say most businesses aren't charities. And I myself have been guilty of saying, okay, well, I can do this in-house and use an AI tool to do my design and marketing. I can do now more of my own work, my accounting work by myself. Or
solopreneurship, let's go.
Tech companies, they're absolutely using Cursor to do their coding. Why would I pay more money? Everyone's just trying to get ahead, right? So it's a capitalist economy. We're not here for handouts. Then what happens is you basically, the system, it almost is designed to make you have greater AI adoption if it financially makes sense. And that is the thing that in Africa is holding AI adoption maybe back, is because people are cheaper. That's a fact. But I also would say that's the glory in Africa at the moment.
It's the opportunity in a sense.
It's the best part is you're not replacing yourselves yet. But we don't know how the story ends. That's the part. We don't know, do we get to an end, which is some utopia tech Trump?
Oh, I have a sense of how that's going, but that's not part of this conversation.
What movie did you watch?
I have my thoughts on that. Maybe the way to wrap up, because we're out of time, and as we know, lawyers ain't free, and billable hours and all that. Are you still in the world of billable hours as lawyers, by the way, just out of fun?
It's actually, again, regulation, because regulation requires you
to
okay. Keep time that way, yeah.
So it must be fascinating watching the McKinsey's, the PwC's, like Accentures of this world, the whole agency world in general, even like creative agency, WPP et al. Go through this existential crisis around like billing hours and stuff. I'd imagine they probably wish they had a legally protected profession in that sense, but
we'll get into it on a different podcast, but due to...
Completely. As I'm teasing, and also I'm going to get people hankering to have you back, because I can totally see a whole show just on that alone. Let's close on this point. you started talking about how you're thinking about this at the level of being a business owner, an entrepreneur slash business owner, a consultant at a certain echelon, serving into that space and tier. Speak to everyday people. I want to say me, but maybe I'm not sufficiently everyday in that sense, who are making micro choices every day about how to adopt, what to adopt, if to adopt certain AI tools, platforms, mechanisms. How much of what we've discussed is applicable to everyday people at the level of, shall I use ChatGPT for this, or shall I use Claude for that, or is Fathom Note Taker or Firefly's Note Taker on this call a good idea?
Let me choose to answer that question from a heart answer. So I've spent a lot of time in the States in the last couple of years, and I spent time in Ohio not very long ago with a good friend. I spent some time visiting some of the Amish villages there, Amish townships, I don't know what you would say.
So they live off grid. They're obviously...
So they have very low technology. And I got to spend some time with some Mennonite people, and they explained to me the test that somebody who is a real believer in that sense is they don't prohibit technology at all. What they do is they ask two questions about a technology. They say, does this technology bring me closer to my family? And does this technology bring me closer to God? And they've been doing it for a long time. So if it's a micro decision, that would be my heart answer.
It's a matter of conscience. Natasha Blycha of Stirling and Rose, but also Nooriam.
Yeah.
My word.
A few irons and a few fires. But so happy to see you. You are still gorgeous. And I have to tell everyone, the most amazing singer. I don't even know if Underlay still sings, but...
I lead worship at church these days, pretty much it. But no, thank you. You had an incredible impact on my life. We started this call offline just talking about how you had a big part in instilling a love for reading. Certainly one that had been instilled much younger, lost a little bit by the time I got to high school. You helped me reignite the love for reading. You actually remembered the book you lent me, which was crazy. It was the first time I'd heard of neurodivergence and Tourette syndrome. Come on. And you remember the actual title of the book. Honestly, remarkable mind, remarkable human being. An incredible journey. Thank you so much for sharing with the village.
One last comment. So I have staff, and I have one of my team members from Africa, and his name is Kosh Jama, and he said to me, how come you get to be on an Africa podcast? Shouldn't it be me? And I said, no, I can be on it. And he said, just call me out, just shout me out, Kosh Jama.
Listen, I don't mind in the least. Shout out to you. He's clearly part of the village, and perhaps he might be next. Who knows? But in the meantime, we're taking who matters. I'm joking. I don't want to start fights. No, honestly, a big shout out to you and your entire team. I know it's taken a village to get you on the show. You know yourself, so I won't name every one of you who had a hand in getting this very busy woman flying all over the world onto the show. Thanks once again, Natasha.